probably the most paramount thing for me. And, I think one of the reasons that we don't allow ourselves to be ourselves in the world, to show up fully as ourselves, to share our experiences, to go to our depths, is that we're terrified. We're terrified of being judged and that being used against us and being seen as weak or wrong, or something wrong with us. And this often this very, kind of underlying fear of not being good enough and all this kind of stuff. So I think the safety that I am safe here, all of me is welcome.
On this week's podcast episode, I talk with Men's Coach Mike Campbell about men's world, navigating the world as a modern day man, the importance of clarity, being the lone wolf, creating safety within a container, inviting other men forward, and much, much more. Enjoy the episode. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Momentum Lifestyle Podcast by myself, Blake Worrell-Thompson.
And me, Genoa Van Keekum. Momentum is a men's wellbeing and performance community dedicated to helping men be better.
Each week, we deep dive with your favorite thought leaders and experts from around the world to get their insights to help you be better. Enjoy the episode. Mr. Mike Campbell, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, mate. Good to be here.
Mate, it's been a few years since we did an event in Sydney. Feels like a lifetime ago. I think it's 3 or 4 years
that's
ago.
Right.
A lifetime ago.
Been a lot of shit in that period.
There's been plenty that has happened. Mates, and before we kind of get into all things men's coaching, men's work, relationships, can you give the guys a 60 to 90 second spiel on who you are and what's got you to where you are today?
All right. Stop, watch, let's go. So I'm Mike and I'm a men's coach. And maybe not too much of a foreign concept to some, but it's a question that I generally get, they're kind of like, what is that? And I suppose the simplest way I sum it up is that I help everyday men get the shit together. Deal with his shit so we stop causing shit for ourselves and others, and we can actually start getting more from life, love, in the everyday. And I suppose the quickest way to say, how did I get here is, just following the journey and evolution of life and me as a person, noticing the taps on the shoulder or maybe ignoring them for quite some time, but eventually tuning into them and following where they took me. A former life as a personal trainer, realizing what I do is I do this thing on the surface, but we're dealing with the emotional piece underneath. And so that's what I need to address. And so that was kind of the rabbit hole, I suppose, in the quickest way of diving in and going, yeah, I mostly work with me. I connect to that. Oh shit, these problems are my problems, or they were. And again, really diving into let's deal with the person at the root of it so we can kind of get to whatever the stuff on the surface that we might think we want.
When it comes to blokes getting their shit together, what do you see as the most common challenge for the modern day man as it stands at the moment? Might be a loaded question. So here you go.
Well, no, that's not loaded. I think that, if I were to flick it around to you, it's one of those questions where you could potentially take it in so many directions, right? And so I think part of the challenge perhaps is that we don't fucking know. There's this thing's happening in our relationship, or, I'm getting undermined at work, or, I feel just empty, or I can't walk down the stairs without puffing. There's so many things that present on the surface, and there's deeper things, right? But often if we maybe try and cut to that deeper thing, it's hard. It's very multifactorial, and it could be potentially over our heads, or some of us. I think when I reflect on that, perhaps the theme that comes through in there is clarity. We're unclear. We don't know really what's going on with us a lot of the time. There might be a funk or some kind of quiet nudge that's telling us something ain't right here. We don't often know, what am I supposed to be? What is my role here as a man? And that might not be a conscious thought, but it's operating because you can speak to those men, and I have, and I've been that man, and it's there. So we're unclear on that. And then what that really extends to is, I suppose, what is it for me to be a man? And I think the ultimate question that stems from that is who am I? And I think that lack of clarity, really actually knowing ourselves, a lot of men are foreign to themselves. And so I think all the things that come off that are many and varied. But I kind of would look at the challenge, let's say, is we're unclear a lot of the time.
When you think about your own personal experience, and I know you've been in this work for a long time now, what did an unclear Mike look like, and what does a clear Mike look like? And potentially, what did that pathway for you look like?
Yeah, I think there's probably an answer, which I'll speak to, but I'll say an unclear. It's an interesting couple of words to run together, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mike is also a Mike that's present occasionally, currently. It's not something that I've clocked and have moved past forever. But I think the biggest period of my life where I would say I was unclear was, maybe if we look at it like this, what you don't know, what you don't know. And as soon as you open your eyes to something, there's a moment where things have changed, right? You can't unsee. And so it's kind of like everything before a certain period of my life was probably somewhat unclear. But I can't view that through the lens that I have now, of course. You know, as a 16-year-old, I was a fucking 16-year-old. But I still think that one of the things for me growing up as an adolescent, as a young man in my 20s, early 20s, was, I didn't really know like what I wanted and what I wanted to do. And that's join the club, you know, so many people. And often the people who really do are like, do you really want to be a lawyer? Is it someone else's idea? So it's normal. But I think, you know, like I was intelligent and curious. I knew I was going to go to university, for example, but I had no idea what I wanted to do apart from like be away from home and getting shit-faced with my mates, basically. And so there was a clarity there, but not like, what do I actually want for my life? Why am I going and spending these tens of thousands of dollars in this degree? That wasn't there. And so I had the support and the encouragement in my family and growing up. But I think, and there's no blame to my parents, but they hadn't been to university and they wanted just whatever you want to do kind of thing, which was lovely. And I think what I lacked in there was like an actual bit of accountability-based kind of like question and direction. Here's your skills, you know, what are you curious about? The things that might have led me to having a little bit more clarity and direction with where I was going. And so that was a theme, I think, that just kind of led me through university. You know, I did a physical education degree and I still came out 5 years going, well, what am I going to do now? And, you know, this was in New Zealand in the early 2000s. And it was a time where you couldn't just, you know, tap into something online for a few weeks and become a trainer. You basically did a degree. And so like half the people in my degree went and became trainers and half went and then did teaching. And I was like, I don't want to teach, which is somewhat ironic now, I suppose. And I was like, well, I've got these skills, so why don't I be a trainer? You know, I just kind of stumbled into it. So again, it was just that kind of theme leading me. The other thing for me, very present in my life forever was, you know, sports, my, I suppose, athletic ability and penchant for doing shit athletic and anything, you know, tennis, cricket, but rugby was the thing that sat at the top of it. And so I kind of thought like, I want to be a professional rugby player and I want to be an All Blacks. It's kind of cliche for a lot of Kiwi young kids. But again, I didn't really know what that required of me, what it asked of me, what it meant in terms of sacrifice. And, you know, like I'm just one of those great cases of I had the talent and the ability, but I didn't really have the ethic or perhaps the bridge between those two of like, let's really connect some of those dots. So again, that's kind of the mode and the stage that led me through to my early 20s, where for me, a big priority was, you know, that kind of fitting in, being liked, and, you know, understandably starting to make my way in the world and find my own place and my own identity, but also like really want to be liked and like got to be, you know, like with my mates, it's the most important thing in the world. I didn't have brothers and that kind of real connection growing up. Those became very important to me. So again, you can see there was these pieces of things that were clear, but still like, who the fuck am I and what do I want? That stuff still wasn't really there. And so I found myself in Scotland in 2006 playing rugby in this tiny, small little town. And, you know, there's many pieces to that puzzle, but here's an obvious one. We didn't have these things. We didn't have certainly smartphones. And so I was presented with this opportunity to spend quite a bit of time with myself. I didn't have easy access to the internet in this town that I was in. So it literally was like, I had one flatmate. He was the like captain and coach of the team. He was a Kiwi. So we had this bond and we trained and we played rugby. And so I started reading a lot of books and spending a lot of time with myself and not like really, really filling it. Although potentially if devices were available, maybe I would have. But I think that was a period for me. And it was a 6-month period of my life. But I think things led to it. I was curious and I really started to inquire a little bit more about myself. And I really noticed, like, you know, all of a sudden I was a single dude, 24, Blake, in a foreign country. I'm the one with the accent, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I was like, holy shit, I'm terrified of being rejected here. You know, rugby, booze, woman, it was like kind of it. And it became very clear to me how much I was in my head. And that was kind of that to me. And it's not in an instant that everything changed. Woo, I'm clear, but I became clear, like, oh shit, that's a thing. And so I started scratching that itch a little bit, and not insatiably or anything like that, but I started to explore a little bit. And I suppose it was the door opening to a bit of self-awareness. So then, you know, that kind of meanders for a few years, but I think that was kind of the start of it, of, again, to the clarity piece, not necessarily like knowing who I am and what I want, but like starting to understand some things about me that felt like I couldn't ignore and that were probably important to address and explore. So that kind of, you know, was, I think, a period started to shift through my kind of mid-20s. And yeah, the levels and versions of clarity, I suppose, have changed and evolved since then.
When you think about clarity, and I totally resonate with so much of what you said, and probably similar clientele who lack clarity. What do you see as the tools that Mike as a 25, 26, 27-year-old would use for clarity and potentially the tools that Mike in his, you still in your 30s or are you ticking?
I was doing 41.
Did ya? 41.
Yeah.
What do you see as the skills and the tools and the differences when it comes to clarity? Because one of the things I heard there, which I can definitely resonate, is probably a lot of knowledge mastery early on in terms of reading other people's content and taking books. Probably wasn't podcasts then, but that type of mastery. Now it's a lot more kind of self-mastery and reflection and probably meditation, a couple of those things. But what do you notice the difference in terms of tools, resources, techniques you used for clarity 15 years ago to what you're using now?
I think, I'll say that there's definitely a theme, but perhaps they were different. And so I think the theme, and I kind of voiced it there a little bit, is like actually spending time with myself. It's very easy to be by yourself, but being with yourself and your thoughts and your feelings and tuning into like your experience is a very different thing. And so how that happens now, is different to how it was. But in some way, like I kind of explained, it was almost forced upon me. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't, because I chose it and I chose to be in that environment, and I could have maybe distracted myself with more stuff. But I think that was it. It was like just being in my presence a bit more. And like maybe a different way of wording it would be not really being able to run for myself. And so I could have, obviously I had choice there. I could have avoided that, but I kind of chose to pay attention. So I think now it's similar, but there's different tools. There's more depth to it. But I still think that there's such a central thing, and that can happen in many ways. But like here's something, for example, that I get the men who come into my coaching academy to do 6 months, and I set them a challenge to spend 15 minutes alone with themselves every day. And that is not doing, not running or walking, not driving the car, not listening to music, nothing. Just sit the fuck down and be with yourself. And like if we did nothing else in that time, you would know a lot more about yourself. But, like to your point, we might gather a lot of data, and I think that's what's missing for a lot of guys, that we don't have information about ourselves. But then, all the information in the world, you read the books, the podcast, is great, but if you don't do something with it, it's kind of pointless masturbation. So next comes, what do we do with this stuff? But it's still, I think it's that invitation to sit with yourself. And, I think the clarity piece for me extends to this reality, I think, for a lot of men, that we don't really know ourselves. And if you want to get to know someone, you got to spend time with it. And it's fucking simple, yet a lot of us don't do it. And there's a real resistance there. If you're someone who this resonates with, like notice what was going on and then the body there perhaps, or the justifications maybe that jump to your head. It's fairly simple. And I had someone just yesterday talk to me about how bored he is doing it. It's super fresh for him. And I'm sitting here going, this is fucking exactly right. This is the medicine that you need, bro. So I think that's really it. Yeah, there's checking in and there's journaling and all these other things. But at the end of the day, it can be as simple as that. And everyone's got that available to them.
Blaise Pascal, man's greatest challenge is sitting with his own thoughts, or something along the lines of that. What have you noticed, if that's a tool that you use so often? You use the word justification. What's the fear, do you think, underneath all of that for many people when it comes to sitting with self?
I think there's potentially many, but maybe broadly speaking, it's what would come into that space. So it says what would come in there. And so maybe to label that would be fear of the unknown that's coming into that. But also some of it I don't think is unknown, because by the very nature of that, we know there's some shit that I probably don't want to come in there. So maybe more, and I think this is probably the challenge for a lot of men, is, to throw some broad blankets over things. A lot of us haven't really learned to kind of connect to our emotionality and to shut off a lot of our experience of the world and life and being a human. And so when faced with those things that we've become very good often at stifling and shutting away and, popping in the bottle and putting the cork on, it seems wildly daunting and confronting and challenging. I know there's some shit there, but I don't want to face it. I'm terrified that I won't be able to handle it. I think that kind of thing, which again maybe broadly speaks to the unknown. Yeah. And like, I'll say a couple of things to that. One, you can, maybe not alone, right? Because we're not really meant to go through challenges and life alone. We're human social creatures, but you can handle some uncomfortable stuff. But I think when we haven't got that emotional literacy, or, our ability to sit with our shit is very low and maybe has been shut off for so long. It's like anything, if you don't work, it weakens. If anyone's ever had like a broken limb maybe it's different these days, but I remember certainly when we were growing up, right? Someone would have a cast on for a while and then they would come back with it off and this arm would be all withered and white and it would atrophy. And I think that's a lot of what's going on for a lot of men, that our emotions, our emotionality, our ability to be a steward for our emotions has been in a cast for so long, and it's withered and it's weak. And when we're facing doing something new, a lot of us want to be fucking amazing and expert at that thing right away because it therefore would hide any potential weakness. So there's that fear of like, I can't handle it, I think is very real for a lot of people, without the grace for like, you just got to slowly get something stronger. You know, like the moment you take the cast off and you try and squeeze a little ball, it's bloody painful and weak. But, you know, progressive overload is unsexy, but it works, right?
You've been in the game a while now. What have you noticed about the general men's space over kind of the last, say, 3 to 5 years? And I'm mindful that both you and I are probably in somewhat of a biased bubble, but what have you noticed in terms of some trends that are changing and potentially how it's impacting the world around us and them?
Yeah, I mean, it's becoming more of a thing, I think, right? Like, I think it's very easy to look at the world and life and men, if you want to, and see the problems. It's very easy to see problems, regardless of where you look. But like, it's a pretty good time to be a human in the big scheme of things. And I think, you know, back to like when I first started kind of working more specifically with men in this area, it was like 2014 is when I released my book. That's fucking ages ago, really. And it's kind of not. But wow, so many more men doing things, people, options, communities, programs, tools, resources, you know. So I think things are expanding and becoming more readily available and perhaps easier to access, because I think that was the challenge for a lot of men. So my experience, you know, like, okay, so for example, like just before this call, I literally got off a call with a group of men who we do a call every week. And one of them is Connor Beaton. He founded a thing called Man Talks, and he's releasing his books today. His book's called Men's Work. And this was the first time in 3 years that we've let the public onto our call. There was a few hundred people register for that call, and all these people on, and co-ed, people asking questions, and it was beautiful. It was interesting because it's, you know, it's like a chat amongst mates. To then open it up, it was quite a different dynamic. But the book is called Men's Work as well, and it's interesting to reflect on because I'm such a huge supporter of what Connor's doing in the book, and it's beautiful and all this stuff. And I think for the longest time, you know, I would say to the effect of like, I'm a man coach, but I don't do men's work, because I think that's been one of the big shifts, is that the way I viewed it, and, you know, I kind of use this term like everyday men. I know that can maybe isolate some people or not. That is everyone at the end of the day. But I think for the longest time, men's work did still exist. And there was this almost underground thing. It's now becoming more mainstream. But in the underground, it was quite a bit more kind of spiritual and, just to use my own slightly judgmental language, fluffy and woo-woo. And what I think was, it wasn't as accessible for your everyday dude. You know, like my mates, they weren't getting into that shit. I mean, I wasn't really getting into it. You know, I wanted to create something that was more resonant for me. And so I think that's been the shift, is that, yes, that stuff's there, but we need an expanse of what is available. Because, of course, there's also the other side of that spectrum, maybe more so in places like America, where it's all hyper masculine, you know, it's kind of married to patriotism and guns and religion and shit like that. But there's this nuance in the middle. And I think that's the thing that's really starting to change, is that to me, if you look at a bell curve, that's where most men sit. And I think that's what's opening up a lot more.
I resonate with that massively. I was listening to a podcast with Connor yesterday, and I can't remember who else it was, but it was another guy who I'm like, okay, those two do a really good job of normalizing the work. And I've always thought that you do that as well. And that's obviously a big piece for us in terms of positioning. And I think, to speak to kind of what you spoke to really briefly, is there's an understandable stigma that has come with quote unquote men's work or men's groups. And that's obviously a part that you've played, you know, in terms of breaking that stigma, the Connors of the world, which will take a little bit of time, I think, but there's some big progress. What do you see as the significance and, I guess, the importance of potentially, I think, and I'm sure you probably agree, all men having a coach on some level, and you obviously position yourself as a man's coach. What do you see as the need for that?
I think I'll perhaps broaden it back to like men in your corner, maybe to a point that I shared earlier. Humans are social creatures. And whilst that's a nice kind of maybe pithy thing to say, You can't fucking hide and run from evolution. About 10 or 12,000 years ago, this is where, like, I did some anthropology at university. This is where the geek comes out. That's where we had the agricultural revolution, where farming started, where we stopped doing what we had done for hundreds of thousands of years. And then, of course, tack on our, early ancestors prior to that, which was mostly moving around in small community groups. The community was fucking important. The integrity of that community was important. Every person in that community had a use, a part to play, right? Bringing men into manhood. All these things were so important, but we were part of. And now we have this fucking idea that, like, we almost glorify the lone wolf. The lone wolf at best fights to survive. At best, he is fighting for survival, yet we glorify it. We thrive in the pack. So we need a pack, whatever that can be. And of course, there's many reasons to, and maybe justifications to, like my family is, or like this thing is, or whatever. But we need people around us as a human. We need love to give and receive. And we need a container that will both see us for who we are, continually invite us into who we can be, and hold us accountable and challenge us into growth. Because again, our growth is really the community's growth. Now, of course, our community, quote unquote, is very different these days. But to me, it's just an undeniable fact. Like, we need water, we need oxygen, we need food, we need sleep. And, you can take on a few other things, but we also need community. And in a community, we need people. And I think for men, there's many aspects, but definitely we need other men who can invite us into the man that we can be, who can be honest with us and keep us honest, who can challenge us, who can call us on our shit with love and compassion and say, like, I see and I know that you're better in this behavior. How can I support you, whatever it may be? So that is a baseline, right? I think, like, it's undeniable that we need people in our corner. And for men, we need other men who can. And that might be any number of things, any number of appearances. If anyone grew up with any kind of team sport, you understand the idea of teamwork. For some people, it wasn't very effective. But if we place it like this, if you were to try and take on that opposition by yourself, you're not going to fucking get anywhere. Like, you need a team around you. And also, what does a team need? It needs coaches, or perhaps it needs people who can see what you can't see when you're in the game and can sit down with you and give you feedback and poke and prod it and challenge and all those pieces. And I think you're a human. Life is a fucking tough opposition, and we need those kinds of, support structures around us.
When you speak of containers and communities, and obviously, you've been in the space, or your book was 9 years ago, so, give or take a decade. What do you think constitutes a healthy container and a healthy community when it comes to like-minded men holding each other accountable to a higher standard and having a really healthy, integration of the masculine, but also obviously the feminine? But what does that healthy container look like? What do you think are some of the, I guess, tools, rules, regulations, resources that might make a healthy one?
Yeah, I mean, some of the pieces that you even just put into that description, like there's accountability, but what does that need? I think safety is probably the most paramount thing for me. I think one of the reasons that we don't allow ourselves to be ourselves in the world, to show up fully as ourselves, to share our experiences, to go to our depths, is that we're terrified. We're terrified of being judged and that being used against us and being seen as weak or wrong, or something wrong with us. And this often this very, kind of underlying fear of not being good enough and all this kind of stuff. So I think the safety that I am safe here, all of me is welcome. And, so what are some pieces around that? I think non-judgment is a fairly important one. And so I kind of extend my containers, I extend that out to, first of all, invite the guys to reflect on, like, what does that even look or feel like? What comes up when you reflect on that? But non-judgment of others and non-judgment of self. And, for anyone listening, and I'll ask the guys, what of those two feels like the most challenging? And for most, it's like, the non-judgment of self, which I think is like quite a significant thing to reflect on, right? Because it's very easy to catch the judgment towards others. And then often what we do is just like springboard that back and judge ourselves. So that creates a level of safety. Confidentiality, I think, is another piece. And then what do these things speak to? I think they speak to respect, which for me, and I think is just such a foundational piece for me. I think we kind of deeply want to be respected. And often we go out into the world in ways that we think will gain respect. So I can respect myself. So again, I think that starts with self and, then the container and others. Confidentiality and those things speak to that. And so this kind of idea of safety, free to be myself, allowed, willing, able to be seen. And then that is safe and welcomed and celebrated. And then in that, it provides the opportunity for, perhaps whatever, but let's just say like growth and expansion. Once I truly know, who Blake is and what he wants, then as I said before, I can also remind you of that and I can hold you to that and I can invite you forward, because guess what? We are, if left in our own company, we're also in the company of our own limitations. And so if I have others around me who can challenge me and hold me to a higher standard that I've set for myself, it becomes easier. But if we have this kind of maybe romantic or idealistic notion that I need to be able to do all that stuff myself, we miss that most of the ways to doing it is through community with others. I think as accountability, as an example, my ability to hold myself accountable has been built on the backs of accountability of others. So then you kind of look at something like accountability and what does that look like? And I think it's a skill that a lot of men don't yet have, because we probably haven't learnt it. We might have learnt a version of discipline maybe growing up, being told off or calling someone out. It's quite common language these days, right? When we think that might be holding someone accountable. But I think accountability needs to have empathy, compassion, and kindness along with it. And so, I can challenge you, but if I'm doing it from a place of kindness and compassion, then it's very different. So that kind of loving challenge. And again, I think that's a skill for a lot of men to learn, but I think there's so much in it. Being held accountable and then being able to provide accountability for others. There's so much growth in that. So, it's kind of like structure and love and softness and welcoming.
I feel, and I don't know if this resonates with you, energetically and maybe people's association to it, there's a really big difference between calling someone out and calling someone forward. Just feels a really different energy. And we've been really kind of mindful of, because it's the irony of the two, halves of this conversation so far is, in the first half, most blokes have got a lack of clarity. And in the second half of this conversation, there's been a lack of real structure and systems in how to hold each other accountable and call each other forward. So of course they don't gel together if neither of them have been that clear, up until now as well. Switching directions when it comes to you and your own evolution and how that's shown up in the relationship sense, which, how long have you guys been together?
We have been married 5 years. Yeah, together about 11.
Solid. Beautiful. So how would you or your partner see Mike from 2011, 2012 to Mike 2020, 21, 22, 23? What are the differences in terms of the work that you've done over the last decade and how that's shown up in your relationship?
I think I can give a perspective on this, but then there's someone else who has a pretty solid one as well. I think if I go back to, kind of 2011, 2012, and perhaps a little bit of history just beyond that, the start of 2010, I was engaged, and there's a whole story, but I'll cut it really short. That engagement was ended over the phone by my fiance in a complete, pulling the rug out from under me kind of situation. My mother was very ill with lung cancer. And so 2010 and 2011 were like very fucking challenging times. My mother passed away in 2011. And, I was in Sydney, they were in New Zealand. So there was a lot of flying back and forth, like fucking booking a flight in the taxi on the way to the airport, all these kind of things. So I was kind of in survival mode a little bit, with that stuff, but also like having to have a business and run things. And then also like being determined to learn from the engagement breaking up. So then I met Nadia, my wife, during that time, and we formed a friendship, and that's really what it was. Then when we started to spend a bit more time together and a bit more intimate, that's kind of like like back end of 2011 and then into 2012. So I think there was a version of Mike that was, I was going to say quite visibly, maybe not, maybe I was quite good at masking it, but certainly struggling, relative to my life at the very least. And so one of the things that I think shifted was at the start of our relationship was when my mother was, we were just kind of like, friends with benefits, that kind of thing. We kind of like each other, but no one really wants to, was that kind of stage. And my mother was very ill. And so we've talked about this, that, look at the universe however you want. But I think my mother's illness and passing actually played like the integral role in Nadia and I getting together, because as she's kind of said, during that time, it was evident that she had to put her shit on hold and just be there for me. And so in a sense, she was kind of leading the relationship a little bit, because I couldn't really, I wasn't really there. I was, and it was a safe container for me to come back to. So I think that probably sums up a lot of it from early on. But in that, and I'm very grateful for, the vision and patience that she had, was a lot of invitation from her to like, so this stuff and this stuff, and you're learning this stuff and you're going through this stuff, but also like, what do you want to do with your life? Like these kinds of questions that I hadn't necessarily contemplated that remarkably. So I think there was kind of that, like keen and eager and able, but not necessarily really fucking taking action on shit and kind of taking charge of my life, more like scrambling and learning and wanting to, ensure that I never had my heart shattered again, those kinds of reactions. So yeah, the shift, many and varied, but to sum it up, I think would probably be not necessarily a complete reverse, but, now like very much leading the relationship and the growth and, being the one who more so kind of invites, into the harder conversations and the expansion and those kind of things. And also with so much more clarity and direction on who I am and what I'm doing and where I'm going and what I'm creating in the world.
Based on what I'm hearing and I guess potentially joining the dots, that must have been an interesting dynamic when it comes to polarity. In terms of, from what I'm hearing, you lacking clarity, her potentially leading. And I think, if I remember correctly, she was pretty sorted from a career point of view. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I would say her career was in
she was pretty clear on it.
At the time.
Yeah. So based on that, and I can vouch, and I'm sure in your world you can vouch for this as well, you're not the only person to ever find that dynamic the case. What did that do at that time to that polarity? So masculine, feminine, kind of the energies of that. And how have you seen that show up for, I guess, other guys?
So I think part of it was maybe like a natural evolution of both people, because for Nards, that was a role that she'd often taken through, if we dig into it, reaction to experiences and getting into self-protection mode and so on. So it worked for her. And she had an awareness to what was kind of going on there. And so part of that awareness was, this is the mode that it has to be for now. Like I said, with her going, all of my shit that I might traditionally bring up right here needs to sit the fuck down, because this dude's, mother's dying and that kind of stuff. So like, again, all the gratitude for that wisdom and awareness. And cool. So now when appropriate, I need to be able to see if he has that strength and he has the structure in which I can then soften and let go and, know that he has me. So yeah, I think kind of enter in the unconscious and definitely conscious testing of that. And so, was it something that I was super aware of at the time? Not necessarily, but certainly some conversations around it for sure as well. So I think it was kind of like, again, more led in terms of the awareness of it from her. And then I, kind of stepped into the role of me, really, that was always there or available, that allowed some of that shifting. And then, butting heads at occasions and not being like, oh, cool, we're done with that mode, let's see it never again. No, not at all. So I think there was shifts then around there and slowly. And then, like a lot of relationships, you settle in and, we moved in together maybe towards the end of 2012. And so I think, that's when you really, someone, and then you really get to know them. And so I think that's where, things were challenged and tested a lot more, certainly in those aspects. And I think, perhaps the simple idea of like, does he have the strength and structure to hold her so she can, kind of soften, let go, etc. I think that picture and the pieces of the equation change with time too, so like my business changes and I, leave this part of my life to enter into this one. And so there's more uncertainty. And so I think those things kind of, continue to evolve, and they still do in their different ways. But yeah, that's probably the way I would explain it. Does it cover it?
Yeah, nicely. Mate, love chatting to you and appreciate the work that you do and the fact that you've been in the space, for 10 years and you've seen so much has been super valuable, even watching your work. And it's cool to see, at least, as someone who's kind of, I guess, fresher to the space, the opportunities that now arises as the rest of the world catches up to what you knew was going to, hopefully unfold 10 years ago. So I appreciate the work that you do. For those that want to find out more about you and the work that you do, where's the best spot for them to find you?
Wherever you are, Instagram, Mike Campbell, MC, Google me. You find me eventually underneath the guitarist for Tom Petty. Yeah, mikecampbell.com.au. And, look, feel free to reach out. I'm always open to questions and feedback. That was probably one of the crucial things in that journey of mine, was actually being open to feedback, and perhaps to that container point you asked earlier as well, right? The giving and receiving of safe feedback. And so, how cool is it when you hear from people who've heard you on something? I just think that's such a beautiful part of the world that we have. So feel free to reach out if you want, or you got some questions.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.